So while you intentionally avoid including those stories, how did your work experience at UPS influence not just you writing the book, but also in your approach?
Well, I think that, people, not necessarily, but I think a lot of times write about what they know, so I think that, your choice of topics or books or, whatever you may be curious about obviously reflects something about your personal experience. And I spent most of my working life in something, which we now call the logistics industry. Uh, but was, which is still best known as, trucking, freight, moving. I mean, we interchangeably use these terms, and everybody seems to know what they're talking about. But we broadly call this the logistics industry now. And when like I tried to say in the introduction, was, it wasn't any attempt at false modesty. I just wanted to make it clear to people that, this is not a book that's a personal memoir. And those have those have important, uh, places in people's understanding of history and, trade union work and things like that. But mine isn't a personal memoir. I just wasn't that important. Uh, mine is a political history, and it was informed by, my previous reading on, the American economy and trade unions and labor. And, I had several influences, I mean, you think about something like, The Flivver King, which was, Upton Sinclair's novelization of sort of the life of Henry Ford, which was very popularly distributed by the UAW in those days of the 1930s when unions would give books to their members. Imagine that. But it was more, I think, influenced by William Sarin's book, The Company and the Union, which is subtitled The Civilized Relationship Between the United Auto Workers and General Motors. And that framework of understanding the, quote, civilized relationship, where it meant that the rank and file were not beneficiaries of the civilized relationship, was sort of the model for writing the book. So what I try to do is to stay away from the personal memoir, though of course, working there, I think it affected the subject matters that I approached in it, to try to talk about three things, which is the interrelationship between UPS, which was a tiny delivery company, a kind of boutique delivery service before World War II, that now morphs into what could be argued to be the largest logistics company in the world. How that interacted with the institution of the Teamsters Union, because early on the Teamsters won bargaining rights. I mean, early on in the company history, not at the beginning of the company history, sometime in the 1930s. It's hard to nail down a little bit, actually, because local union record keeping is terrible.
Right.
But sometime in the 1930s, and the UPS and the Teamsters grew together from, say, the Second World War on. And the other factor in that is rank and file workers who were influenced by different political ideas and ideas of what a trade union is, and their own experience in conflict with the company and with the union, and in conflict with both at many times. And so those three things are what I try to kind of lay out in the history of UPS and the Teamsters, and what that meant both for workers at UPS, but particularly what was the impact of that from the 1970s onward, where UPS emerges as not just this massive US corporation, but a kind of trendsetter in labor relations, and what the consequences were that for the American working class as a whole, which you have to say are pretty negative.
What were some of those consequences? Admittedly, before reading your book, I did not know a whole lot about the inner workings of the Teamsters. And what I found to be really interesting was that, it's a political history, but it's a political history of the Teamsters, as well as shedding a light on national politics, So how, when you're talking about how UPS and the Teamsters kind of grew in tandem,
Mhm.
does that, business and management in labor unions, what does that relationship and that growth do for the rank and file?
Well, I think let's start with a couple of things. First of all, people obviously know, whether it's good or bad, right or wrong, is that their knowledge of the Teamsters is mostly from the movies, which unfortunately most of the time is absolutely true. Uh, there's been no movie made yet about, rank and file rebels or Ron Carey's years in the Teamsters. That's not as glamorous as, the murderous reign of Jimmy Hoffa, but maybe someday. I do think one of the benefits, it may be an unintended benefit of The Irishman, which was a very popular recent Netflix production, is that I hope it deglamorizes Jimmy Hoffa Sr., because I think what it does is it sort of takes away a lot of the myths about him. Not completely. And there are things that Hoffa Sr. was very clever at, but he spent the last few years of his life skulking around with his mobster buddies who got tired of him bothering him about being put in charge of the union again, and they eventually got rid of him. So I hope that deglamorizes who Hoffa Sr. was. Unfortunately, through most of the history of the Teamsters, except for very short periods of time, the Teamsters has been largely dominated by people who thought unions were a business. So, you're not talking about people who were the UPS or other major employers had a hard time convincing, of having very conservative, contracts and approach to, the health and welfare of their members. What really kind of changes, and I think the economic impact and political impact of this for a lot of workers outside of UPS is from the 1970s onward. I mean, UPS, becomes in 1976 a 48-state contiguous operation. And the reason I put that for our listeners is because, the world of, the kind of New Deal regulation of American business meant that, any freight company mostly had to, even if it was recognized as a national carrier, recognition, and that doesn't happen until 1976 UPS. There's also several other things that go on in the 1970s. One is with the end of the post-war boom, that the American business goes into two offensives. One is internationally against their rivals, and the other is domestically against their workers. So you see a bigger push by the bosses to lower wages, speed up and make working conditions far worse than they had been before. This is when even many old style, older generation of UPS workers, they noticed that there was change. Sometimes they identify that change with Jim Casey, the founder and longtime CEO and chairman of the board of UPS, sort of, playing coming to an end of that type of role in the company. So the old boss is gone and the new guys take over and they screw. There's an element of truth to that, but there's much larger forces at work. And the third is that from the 1970s, in the 1970s, you also saw, the first sort of national explosion of rank and file rebellion inside the Teamsters and inside UPS. And while much of that, kind of either recedes, goes underground until it reemerges in a different form a few decades later, it's the 1970s that are a turning point on all of these things. UPS becomes a massive company, which employs, over 100,000 people. It begins to dwarf all the other major freight companies in terms of what it represents in the Teamsters Union. And a couple of the consequences of that are that, unlike in, say, the 1960s, when Hoffa Sr., his kind of last big achievement was creating the National Master Freight Agreement, which organized the great bulk of the freight industry in the United States and represented hundreds of employers kind of smashed into this, one agreement. And I think it was something like 500,000 truck drivers and warehouse workers were covered by the Master Freight Agreement. And UPS is really kind of seen as a minor player in all that. So 20 years later, 30 years later, UPS becomes the largest Teamster employer, with nearly, between it and UPS Freight, with somewhere between 280, 300,000 workers. And the Teamsters themselves shrinks from peaking out at about 2.2 million in the mid 70s to declining pretty badly to about half that size when Ron Carey was elected Teamster president in 1991. So this period from the 70s through the early 90s is a kind of big role reversal. The Teamsters, which had been this incredibly powerful union, gets sapped of its strength. UPS, which had been a kind of marginal Teamster employer, becomes the most dominant Teamster employer. And here we are in 2020, and UPS is now the largest private sector employer in the country. So when you pull back the lens and look backward and come forward on all of these things, it's pretty important to understand the dynamics of all of that to understand where we got to right now.
And I guess thinking more currently, but also going back in time with focusing on working conditions.
Mm-hmm.
That I noticed in your book was that UPS keeps making more money, but
Mm-hmm.
working conditions essentially just seem to worsen.
Yes.
From the switch and focus on to logistics and into today. So I was kind of wondering if you could talk about how the company evolves, but working conditions essentially seem to worsen.
Well, I think that, ever since the rise of industrial capitalism, the workplace has always been a battle between workers and the bosses over working conditions. I mean, I think you have to say that because it's not like that's a new thing. I think what's important to recognize is that, when workers were able to win through hard-fought campaigning, better conditions through their contracts, but also through federal laws like OSHA, that were created in the early 70s. It took until 1970 to pass, a Workplace Safety Act in the United States. I mean, one of the bizarre, twists on, Upton's, Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which was meant to be about the working conditions, of workers, and to highlight that is that what the media glommed onto was really how badly the food was processed. And so, which isn't an irrelevant issue, don't get me wrong. It's just that it was much more acceptable to the liberal, progressive-minded middle classes to campaign for something around food safety, but it took another 70 years for workers to get that type of consideration. And so ever since the 1970s, the employers, have been carrying out a political campaign to weaken, if not to outrightly abolish OSHA. And so you have two things particularly going on with UPS, is that one is that working conditions have always been a battleground, both inside the hubs where people load, unload, sort packages, deal with all sorts of, chemicals and so forth that spill, break open, ventilation issues, and drivers who are out on the streets, running their asses off, dealing with heavy packages, trying to make these, really unbearable, numbers every day in pretty horrendous conditions. So, well before the pandemic hit and those issues of the safety around the coronavirus, in the summer of 2018 and 19, the media highlighted both the death, injuries caused by excessive heat to particularly to package car drivers in the summertime, and this wasn't just in the Southwest; it was all over the country. And so, UPS has gotten very rich off of a couple of things. One is they really introduced, part-time work on a scale that had previously not existed before, at least within one company. So, today, as has been true for many decades now, 2/3 of UPSers are part-timers who mostly work in the hubs. They have a 90% turnover rate, and that is the industry standard. So, whether you go to FedEx or Amazon, I can't speak for the post office on that issue because I just don't know. The three big private employers are mostly part-time, horrendous turnover rate, terrible working conditions. And much of this derives from what UPS began particularly in the 1970s. So I think that, I think this is, and they've made an enormous amount of money off this. It's not just the people who are part-time, but, they earned, a third or half the wage of full-time workers, which is still true to this day. And so, and who are hyper exploited inside the hubs. So I think that, when you look at this picture, UPS, which, for most of its history, didn't do any advertising. It was, it kind of snuck up on its competitors. I think I have a chapter called The Quiet Giant where, by 1968, it's delivering half the number of packages as the post office. So it becomes like the other post office, but which had this kind of image of being, a benign employer and company owned by the workers, because management was largely owned the bulk of its stock. And it's almost until very recently, every head of the company had been a UPS worker at some point. Carol Tomei, who is now, CEO, was taken from Home Depot. So that tells you something about the changes at UPS. But it had this kind of image and it had a lot of friends in the media who kind of promoted this image. And then in the late 1980s, it began, doing television commercials for the first time, which are just kind of fun to look at and laugh at. We like to keep our trucks clean, and always sort of promoting this kind of image of the modern stellar corporation. But I think, I wasn't the first person to say that, behind this kind of, 20th, now 21st century image are really kind of 19th century working conditions.
Definitely. Even today. I guess from there, thinking about, the power of UPS and the growth of UPS, into the 1970s, another thing that really interested me in your book was the role of the federal government, or the role of the state, because it's, the state at the local level, regional level, but also the national level. So, I'm thinking about things like, federal highways, also deregulation. So,
Right.
what would you say is the role of, the federal government throughout the history of UPS and the Teamsters, not just in terms of the growth of UPS, but also for reducing and diminishing the power of OSHA? I think OSHA is really important because we think about today how OSHA is kind of still an empty shell. And one of the questions I had in reading your book was, did the lobbying power that was used to reduce and undermine OSHA essentially, has OSHA ever recovered? Is it an empty shell based on, the power of political lobbying in undermining OSHA that you talk about in your book?
Well, I'll say yes, but corporate America is still, hates OSHA. You have to remember that even having a shell of an operation is still having a shell of an operation. And, if we start with most recent stuff, OSHA for the most part has been completely absent around dealing with issues related to the pandemic. So in some sense, that is a result, not just of Trump, but, of a kind of campaign that really got going in the 1990s with the so-called Republican Revolution to kind of almost do away with it. I kind of go through a lot of that. There's a whole chapter on that in the book because I see that as, very important. I think you have to, when you pull back the lens, is that, you go back to the turning point after World War II, where, after, the wartime contingencies, the question was, what role would the federal government play in economic development, shaping it, spending it? And of course, the thing that is the most prominent, because we're on them every day, is the federal highway system. And that was a boon for the entire, freight industry. So, railroads, even though, trucking becomes motorized during World War I, and Eisenhower leads this very famous truck caravan across the country during the 1920s to kind of highlight, how backward the American road system was, how inadequate it was. And a lot of this is couched in military terms. The fact is, it's not surprising that 30 years later, it's Eisenhower who presides over the National, Defense Highway Act, which is the formal name of the federal highway system. But after the Second World War, the growth of the federal highway system, along with state spending, is what kind of shifts the shipment of goods regionally and locally away from the railroads to the trucking industry, to the freight industry. And of course, it's not an accident that, not only does that take place, but, the New Deal legislation, because trucking becomes federally regulated during the 1930s with the Motor, Carrier Safety Act, is that it's all about the stability of the industry, because nobody wants to go back to this kind of chaotic, boom bust way of operating businesses. And so, you put all those together, is that you have this massive boom in federal spending on highways and a comparable state spending. This really greases the road, literally, for the massive expansion of the trucking industry. And one part of that is UPS, but that's still to be seen down the road. And the kind of tight regulation to promote stability in the industry itself creates this situation in which the Teamsters as an institution just grows massively. And the Teamsters themselves are just so much bigger than most trucking companies. I was telling another interviewer a few days ago, even in the 1980s, where I was working at a local trucking company in Mass called APA Transport, which is now long gone, and was based in northern New Jersey. I was astounded to learn that at one point it was considered to be the fourth largest trucking company in the country, because to me it seemed pretty small. Even today, of the last of the big unionized trucking companies that the Teamsters represent, YRC, which is the modern version of Yellow Freight and Roadway into one company for the last decade or so, decade and a half, represents about 30,000 Teamsters. Now, that's big for a trucking company, but compared to the 280,000, 300,000 people who work for UPS, it's pretty tiny. It's like 1/10, right? So I think that they created this very stable system and very well-funded system for road transport, which of course meant that the Teamsters could grow massively, particularly in the industry, which provided the basis for the National Master Freight Agreement, which some of the big trucking bosses were quite happy to sign, because we always, there's an image of Hoffa always being a rebel and a fighter for the workers, and of course some of that is very true. It's also true that his attempts to create a national freight contract were welcomed by many of the bosses, because it also stabilized the industry. It rationalized wages and working conditions and benefits, and bosses like that sort of stuff, right? And so Hoffa had another image among many of the employers for the as a good figure in that way. I mean, that's not highlighted very much in the myth making about Hoffa, particularly it doesn't come from the windbagging of Teamster officials. Let's put it that way. And so, but this whole thing really collapses in the 1970s with the deregulation of the kind of movement during the course of the 70s to deregulate a whole parts of the U.S. economy. And when trucking and aviation and finance and a whole series of industries are deregulated in the early late 70s, early 80s, much of what the basis for the Teamsters Union growth just disappears. And of course, that's usually identified with Ronald Reagan, but I think it's important to recognize that these were politically driven particularly by Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter. And a lot of the, particularly in the trucking industry, those who had a vested interest in keeping the system the way it was, because, in a lot of ways, the way the trucking industry was organized for the benefit of a few, was, a perfect example of just crony capitalism. Ralph Nader, who regretted at first advocating deregulation, and he said it later, he said, it was the biggest mistake in my life. One of the original studies of his, Nader Raider groups was to expose how corrupt the Interstate Commerce Commission was. And it's all right. He's absolutely true, right? For a lot of liberals, the solution to that was deregulation. Of course, what deregulation really did was that it led to a collapse of old companies and a massive attack on older secure workers and worsening working conditions for the rest. So by the late 1990s, Mike Belzer, who was an academic who, was a Teamster at one time, wrote a book called Sweatshop on Wheels, which documented the horrendous conditions of truck drivers, mostly, and warehouse workers, but mostly truck drivers. And, then 20 years later, Steve Fuseli wrote a book called The Big Rig, which just tells you how worse things have gotten over the last 20 years. So I think that's kind of, trying to look at things from the long term about what happened in freight. And of course, during that same time, you have the rise of UPS as the major, Teamster employer. And what makes it, it makes it an oddity in the logistics industry is that it's unionized. So if you compare that to FedEx, which has its origins in the 1970s, or Amazon, which, was founded in 1995, now a massive employer, is that they're almost exclusively non-union. I mean, they have little parts of them that are unionized, but, they're defined by being non-union employers. So that's both what makes UPS sort of an oddity and has a unique history. And part of the reason why UPS has continued to be a major player in the trucking industry is because the Teamsters have been there to primarily, except during the years of Ron Carey, to make sure that UPS remains competitive with the other employers, and the people who have not benefited from that are the rank and file of the Teamsters or the non-union workers at other big logistics giants.
Now this is just kind of a reaction of to what you said, kind of like the, how we understand neoliberalism essentially, but kind of, neoliberalism in the 1970s is this like, bipartisan, large, partly democratic, gutting of regulations. And I was wondering if, because I feel like at least, my oversimplified understanding of the Teamsters is that they are one of the more conservative unions out there. And I was wondering if, those that are mindful of, labor history and political history, if that's something that they use to, kind of be hypercritical of the Democratic Party even today, because they can point to, someone like Jimmy Carter and deregulation, or even Ralph Nader. So it seems like, politically that the Democratic Party has not been too kind to, the rank and file UPS workers and Teamsters. So I was wondering if you've ever noticed anything like that.
Well, I mean, I think sometimes, I think some of it is also just a lot of, bullshit and maneuvering. I mean, the thing about if you look at the Hoffa years, the Hoffa Senior, Hoffa supported people who were willing to support him. So, we think of the battles with, Robert Kennedy when Hoffa had to go before the Senate Rackets Committee. And I think what's always sort of, on one hand, one of the things Hoffa was very clever about during those hearings, for example, is that he very much played the wounded, angry worker against this snotty rich kid. What sort of is forgotten in all that is that Kennedy was pretty much right on all about the corruption of Hoffa and the Teamsters, right? So, I think that, while they had their own interest for going after Teamster corruption, which was real, and the violence in the union, which was real, mostly directed at Teamster members, Hoffa was able to kind of try to turned it into a public relations boon for himself, okay? Now, I think when you go back and look at the big picture again on these things, is that ever since the rise of industrial capitalism, that, particularly with the creation of a single market across the United States, to look at the vantage point from here, is that transport workers, whatever they may be, right, dominant groupings, whether it's railroad workers or, waterfront workers or truck drivers or delivery workers now, is that those are potentially, and have at different points in time, shown themselves to be very powerful groups of workers who can help raise, the political power and working conditions of the entire working class, which is why throughout American history, it's not an accident that those unions and their leaders, who have been very different individuals and very different politics throughout history, have been the subject of federal government political repression. So it's not an accident, for example, the most modern uprising of industrial workers in the late 19th century was the 1877 railroad strikes, which are always portrayed as uprisings, which is really what they were in a lot of ways. I mean, where railroad workers and sympathizers took over whole towns and cities. They had to be crushed by the federal army. Eugene Debs, of course, the most famous American socialist, began life as the leader of the American Railroad Union and was put in prison following the Pullman strike, which, was defeated, but kind of was one of the major labor battles of the 1890s. It made him a socialist. When you move into the 20th century, Harry Bridges led the organizing of the West Coast Dockers. Harry, of course, had, a lifelong sympathy, possible, but it's never been proved, membership in the Communist Party, but that was clearly the people that he looked to for their leadership. In the mid-1930s, was the Minneapolis Trotskyists who led the struggles that really created the idea of what a modern trucking union would look like, who were later, Harry Bridges was subject to 20 years of political persecution. The Minneapolis Trotskyists, with the help of people like Jimmy Hoffa, were driven out of the union in the early 1940s. And then Hoffa himself, becomes the focus of federal government's investigations and scrutiny because, it's really over-the-road freight drivers who become, along with auto workers, really the most powerful workers in the country. And so, when you look at this history, you have to say that this is a continual feature of American politics in the labor movement. Now, of course, when you look at the modern history of the Teamsters, is that there's, this stuff goes back and forth, and you have to get underneath the surface of politics sometimes. One of the things about the 1980s onward is well, at least during the course of the 1970s and 1980s, is that the Teamsters under Frank Fitzsimmons, and then continues up until Ron Carey is elected, develop a political alliance with, with the Republican Party, and most notably with the Reagan administration. And that was just straightforwardly a way of staying out of jail. Let's just be honest about it, okay? Yeah, okay. Over the last, since the early 1990s, is that by and large, whether it was Ron Carey didn't endorse, as far as I can tell, and after talking to people, because I've never been able to see it, he didn't really endorse Clinton for re-election in 1996. But, the Teamsters largely support Democratic presidential candidates. But like most unions, they spread their money around. And so today, for the last 20 years or so, Jim Hoffa Jr., who's announced his retirement, they'll endorse the Democratic candidate. But a lot of the policies that they support are, Trump's policies. So, Hoffa's been one of the more vocal supporters of Trump's trade wars, or, loosening environmental restrictions, supporting pipeline construction, and a whole host of other issues. And of course, that's not atypical of many trade union leaders, particularly in the skilled trades, who are either half in bed with Trump or fully vocal in their support of Trump. And that is not something that's disconnected either from the rank and file. I mean, we learned, a lot of industrial workers have been, and union workers have been voting Republicans throughout the 20th century. And from, the election of Ronald Reagan onward, a large number vote for Republican candidates. And of course, in 2016, large numbers of UAW members, large numbers of Teamsters voted for Donald Trump, and may have provided, and probably did provide, that thin margin of victory in the upper Midwest, which allowed him to win the Electoral College. So, this kind of, political maneuvering at the top, which is, not really benefited rank and file workers at all, is also part of a deeper problem of some pretty backward politics, xenophobia, racism that exist among the American rank and file. And, union membership is not proved to be a barrier to these ideas.
Yeah, definitely. Let me see, where was I?
In a lot of ways, Alan, I would say that, particularly in the upper Midwest, a lot of the kind of xenophobic trade policies of the UAW and the steel workers and the Teamsters, legitimized a kind of Trumpian politics long before Donald Trump ever showed up.
For sure.
You know.
I mean, as a personal aside, like my family's from Western Pennsylvania, and my uncle, who I'm named after, was actually an extra in the 1993 Hoffa, and he's one of the cops that is escorting Jack Nicholson out of the hearings.
Right.
I used to go to Blockbuster Video as a kid, and I would point to my friends. I'm like, "There's my uncle on the back of the Hoffa." I wasn't allowed to see the movie as a kid. My parents wouldn't let me. So yeah, I've always found the like Hoffa and the Teamsters interesting, but I was really kind of blown away by the inner workings and like the power of the Teamsters, and again the importance of lobbying. Like in my own work, I look a lot at like the business community, and I look at deindustrialization in Baltimore and the role of the business community, Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, and kind of how business lobbies, especially in the 70s and moving forward. So you talk about the history of the lobbying power of UPS and its impact both politically and on the rank and file?
Well, I think, you have to, we'll start with a few things. I mean, I think that, UPS is a major political player in Washington and in most state capitals. And it's not an accident, I don't think at all, that it's particularly important in those states or cities which are important transportation links. So, if you look at, those states where that's important, California, Illinois, so forth, UPS is a major political player. If you look on the committees that in Washington, that whether they're the House or the Senate, that provide, deal with things over trade and working conditions and so forth and so on, things that they see as vital interests, UPS has given plenty of money to the people who run those committees. And while, it's typical of corporate America that's 2-to-1, usually for the Republican versus the Democrats get plenty of money from UPS. And including to, very famous liberal icons. I mean, John Lewis, who recently passed away, who's, is rightly seen as a, icon of the civil rights era, became a pretty moderate congressman over time from Atlanta. Atlanta, suburb of Shady Springs, is where UPS has its corporate headquarters. And Atlanta itself is a major and, John Lewis did lots of favors for UPS, so I think that's important. I think it's also important to look at, for example, look at places like Louisville, Kentucky, or Memphis, Tennessee, which, were long in decline river cities, where UPS in Louisville and FedEx in Memphis built their major air operations. Right now in Louisville, of course, there's a major fight over, in the investigation and ultimately the lack of prosecution of the cops who killed Breonna Taylor. Well, this is a city and a state that's, UPS is a major factor in what goes on economically and politically in those states. So, there are, roughly 15 to 20,000, maybe more, workers at UPS who work at Worldport in Louisville, largely part-time. So when you talk about issues of poverty and inequality in a place like Louisville, Kentucky, you should go talk to UPS about that. And I would say the same thing about FedEx in Memphis. I think that when you talk on a national scale, is that look at politics right now. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader is from Kentucky. Major supporter of UPS. UPS makes a lot of campaign contributions to him. Elaine Chao is the, Secretary of Transportation. She was the Secretary of Labor under Bush II. So UPS is, supportive of both of these people. So they got us hooked and they got us on both ends there, right? And, UPS has a very close relationship with the Trump administration. Now, like most of corporate America, I mean, there's always exceptions here and there and so forth. But, in 2016, for example, UPS was very cool to Donald Trump, like a lot of corporate America was, because they were supportive of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They didn't like his attack on many of the trade agreements, and, several things like that. But after he was elected, they worked their way back to him. So they were a major donor to his inauguration committee. And over, since last year, it may have begun beforehand, but, like everybody else, I get my information from media. They developed a very, close relationship with the Trump administration, including, David Abney, having, and, being invited to a state dinner at the White House. And ever since the pandemic began, UPS has been a major player in the Trump administration's Operation Airbridge, which was at least the initial effort to get PPE in large numbers into the United States. And I'm not faulting them for playing that role. What I think it illustrates, however, is that they have a very close relationship with the federal government, and the federal government doesn't have a very close relationship with rank and file workers. Now, I think that, ever since the pandemic began, you can find Trump or the leaders of UPS and others, who, will declare, logistics workers, UPS workers, essential workers. Well, I think, those of us who always work in industries know that we're essential. It should be graded, it should be, or called heroes. We should be skeptical of people who, who preside over some of the worst working conditions in the country and have some of the worst political agendas, all of a sudden embracing us. I would greet it with great skepticism. So, I think that's where things are at. I haven't recently looked at, where UPS is putting its money in the presidential race. I'm assuming that, it's going into various Trump operations. But I did notice, a lot of it's also going to Democrats in some of the bigger U.S. Senate races. So when people look at this, it should tell us that, while it may be 2-1 in favor of the Republicans, the fact is, UPS has major influence in two parties, and maybe it's time that, and where we have a union leadership and a corporation who may endorse formally different candidates, but find themselves supporting similar policies, then maybe it's time that the rank and file workers had a real political alternative in this country when, the bosses and the union leaders agree too much of the time.
It's really fascinating to me just thinking about, I always see it through a lens of corporatism. It's not necessarily, partisan one way or the other. But, corporatism is often like a bipartisan transnational affair. So right. I would kind of see, UPS as a heavy donor, almost donating to both political campaigns. But what this also, I think, speaks to is the image of UPS.
Right.
Because it seems like this is not very publicly known. We know Home Depot gives a lot of money to the Trump administration. We know Taco Bell gives a lot of money to the Trump administration. I think it's assumed that folks in the logistics industry would give a lot of money to the Trump administration, but it doesn't seem public. It seems like UPS puts a lot of money into sanitizing their image.
Well, they do. There's that part of it. They have their own, PR operation. If people have time to read it, there's a book by Deepa Kumar called Outside the Box, which is really about the media's relationship with the UPS strike in 1997. It's very well worth reading. I think that when it comes to, the relationship of, big capital to politicians, is that they view them like they would hire a junior executive. If you can do the job for us, we'll support you and finance you. And if not, we'll get somebody else. They have a pretty straightforward relationship on this sort of stuff. Because the Democrats still rely on a connection to our long declining trade union movement, though, it does mean that they have a bigger bias in favor of the Republicans. And so, that is a real dynamic that exists there. So you can see how some of that played out during the 1997 strike, where, they, very publicly called for the federal government to intervene to shut down the strike, and Clinton didn't do that. So that infuriated them. But then later, Clinton's Justice Department and with their Republican friends in Congress were able to sort of witch hunt Ron Carey out of the leadership of the Teamsters Union. So, one has to see, how big capital rules through various methods at different points in time.
So you mentioned the 1997 strike,
Mhm.
which seems to get a lot of urgency in your book. Could you talk about it in a bit more detail? Just how did it start? Why was it successful? But also the legacy of it, in terms of how it's remembered, but also the attempts to forget it, and how something like the 1997 strike can inform current and future strikes and struggles.
Well, I think the problem is that it's fading in people's memory. I think that it's one of the things I was part of the motivation to write my book after I wrote a lot of articles about UPS is that I'm always surprised that when you go to the library, for example, and you look at in the big history sections, which are all history of major corporations and their founders and all of that, that there are very few books written on UPS. I mean, and most of them are either memoirs from management or a couple of very hagiographic, fawning histories of the company by business writers. I mean, UPS has been, has been continuously in operation since 1907. Jim Casey, who founded the company with, his brothers and his friends, lived into a very ripe old age into the 1980s, and UPS has had a major impact on American capitalism and labor relations, and yet nobody would know his name out in the street, but everybody knows Henry Ford, you know. Um, I think that, I tried to correct, my small effort at trying to correct that is with my book, but it's mostly written for really union activists or aspiring union activists. It's not written as a kind of popular memoir. But I think that was one of the reasons I wrote it. One of the things that I also noticed, you couldn't help but notice, is that when I went and looked at Bill and Hillary Clinton's biographies, when he was president, she was first lady during the UPS strike, and then I went to the index and looked up Teamsters, Ron Carey, United Parcel Service. They're not mentioned at all in the books. So that's one aspect of, the organized forgetting. I think that in 97, the strike itself was the most important industrial strike in nearly a generation. It was a nationwide strike. I mean, that's the one thing about being a logistics giant is that it's not a regional company. UPS is everywhere. It had long more than just the other post office for people. And that's only grown since the late 1970s. And, millions of people have worked for UPS, whether it's for a day or 5 years or nearly a decade like myself, or people have worked there their entire lives. There are millions of people like that right now. And certainly on the eve of the 97 strike, that was certainly true. And, the strike itself, I think would have been wouldn't have happened unless you had, the two biggest changes in the organization of the Teamsters and its political leadership. The first was winning the right to vote during the course of the late 1980s, which was spearheaded by Teamsters for a Democratic Union, because there was a move by the government to trustee it. And there was a successful campaign to say, well, we shouldn't be run by a trustee appointed by the federal government. God knows what that would have looked like. Members should have the right to vote. And that meant throwing out the old method of really just convention delegates electing presidents. And convention delegates almost always were officers. So it's really officers electing officers. And then the membership winning the right to vote meant that the broad membership could have a right to vote on it. One person, one vote. And then the second part of that, of course, was the election of Ron Carey, who was a local officer in New York, who was not only had a reputation and the reality of being, not tied up with the mob, but had a reputation as being a militant against UPS. And though he had a kind of sort of moderate Republican politics, but his reputation was as a fighter. And unlike many Teamster officers, he actually worked as a UPS driver. His father was a UPS driver, which again makes him pretty unique among Teamster officers, particularly at that time. I think it's still true. Not always, but still true. And so when he was elected, and his executive board were a majority of, TDU members, it was a political earthquake that went off, not only inside the labor movement as a whole, who were like kind of like the old guard, who was clearly, shaken by it, both inside and outside the Teamsters, but it was something of a bombshell that went off among Teamster employers who were used to having a very predictable, very cozy relationship with the Teamsters Union, both on the national level and which they call the international, but it's the national level, and the local level. And so I think you can draw a line from Kerry's election, then re-election in '96, where the question of how to take on UPS was central to his re-election campaign in the 1997 strike. So I think I can safely say if Ron Kerry wasn't general president of the Teamsters, there probably wouldn't have been a strike. I can probably safely say that. And the issues of the strike were very important, which was, creating more full-time jobs because UPS had decimated them, full-time wages, preserving the health and welfare benefits that were beneficial to the ones that the company wanted to seriously diminish. But also, I think the other part of that was that, the union had come alive. I think this is the experience of many people who are reformers in whatever union or industry that they may be in, is that what really annoys the bosses at first is, while they may be annoyed at demands for higher wages, better benefits, and better working conditions, issues that deal with racism or sexism on the jobs, what really perturbs them is that the union comes alive and rank and file members start to feel like they have not only a stake in the union, but they themselves come alive and believe that they can be worker leaders on the job and they can run the union and they probably can run the company better than the bosses do. And I think all of that really explodes in the summer of '97, where, the slogan of the strike was "Part-time America won't work." And it proved itself to be like incredibly popular. So despite the company's efforts at portraying Kerry as, being a dictator, he won't let his members vote, he's a radical, all sorts of, and UPS had a lot of friends in the media, let's be very clear about that. It really flopped. And, like Deepa's book does, is it shows very quickly how the attitude of the media changed. And so they go out and they interview rank and file workers. And so for the first time in, ever, workers who work at some UPS hellhole in the middle of the night are being asked by the New York Times what they think about their lives and where is it going and what they want from their working conditions. And so, Kerry was able to preside over this, very important strike. I mean, even Jim Kelly, who was, the CEO of UPS at the time, when they asked him in this one unguarded moment live on national television, well, if you were a worker, would you support the strike? And he says, well, I guess if I was a hardworking UPS worker, I would be on strike. So, it's sort of like the whole edifice of UPS's image, its posture, its attacks on the Teamsters, its attacks on personal attacks on Ron Kerry all kind of fell away. And they capitulated. It was the biggest union victory. I mean, hands down union victory in many years. Now, there was also some problems within that, but those are secondary. And when the company counterattacked with their Republican friends, the union took a big hit, including, it took us several years to implement some of these victories, and they were implemented in a way that pissed off most people. I was there during that time, and I can tell people all about that, but the minutiae, I'm sure, will bore people. But I think there was the idea that it was a stolen victory. And Kerry himself was driven out of the union, but later vindicated in federal court, which didn't impact his status as either a member or a leader of the Teamsters. So I think that when you go back to, you battle over what happened, first of all, and why it happened, and the legacy of that, now that we are now 23 years later, that for, I think, most workers who were around then or hired soon after, there's some sense that that's the last time the union really stood up to the company. And so that it plays that role. But there's also been attempts at kind of wiping away that. I mentioned the Clinton biographies, but most people don't read Clinton biographies. That's not really all that important. But, like if you go to like the Teamster website and you go through, Teamster history, they'll talk about the 97 strike, but they won't mention Ron Carey's name because Hoffa and the people who took over afterwards wanted to bury Ron Carey's legacy. And I think also that, during the course of the 90s and the 2000s, I think it's changed a little bit lately, is that there was a diminishing interest in writing about the history of American workers or industrial workers in particular, or the Teamsters, because the Teamsters were just seen as this kind of, bastion of gangsterism and corruption, and that's all been done before, right? And so, I still think the big important biography of Ron Carey still needs to be written by someone. I still think that there's plenty of stuff to write about the 1997 UPS strike. I think there's still plenty to be written about the sort of UPS rank and file struggles in the 1970s. All those things are important. But I think you can't help but notice that, there was an effort to really wipe that or to massage it into a negative way or a diminished way very soon after the 97 strike. And I think since really things began to turn around a bit with, when Coral won the election in the Chicago Teachers Union, and you saw the Chicago teacher strike of 2012, and then, the ripple effect that took some time to work its way up into other teacher locals or statewide teacher federations, but kind of, exploded during the course of 2018, is an example of, once again, a sense of expectations being raised among larger groups of workers, and hopefully a rediscovery of the militant struggles that aren't that long ago. I mean, it's only 23 years ago that the UPS strike took place.
Yeah, yeah. I think the one thing that it made me think of is a couple of months ago I did an interview with Peter Cole about the ILWU
Right.
and dock worker power.
Right.
And the ILWU is very, very interested in workers knowing their history.
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of wondering, similar of the Teamsters,
No.
what a book like yours could do for the rank and file at the Teamsters knowing their history.
Yes.
So what this brings me to is kind of like labor education and the importance of labor history and labor education. I mean, looking at the AFL-CIO archives, I mean, I see a lot of pamphlets, publications, and just what labor education looked like at the height of the labor movement compared to what labor education looks like today. So I was kind of wondering what a book like yours.
Well, I mean, it would be great if unions actually educated their members. But, remember, labor history and labor education is not something that's absent from, politics. So, most trade union education, I mean, maybe that's speaking too broadly, but at least that's my experience, is largely focused on very low-level discussions of grievance procedures, and you may get a little bit more than that, but they're needed, but they're deathly boring. I mean, but to go through, the origins of a union, the politics and ideas that animated its leaders, what are the legacies of all of those things, is contested political terrain. I mean, we can't separate that. If you go back to the 1930s, say, when, I was, like I included in the book, I was astounded to learn that the UAW bought up 200,000 copies of The Flivver King and handed it out to Ford workers and whoever wanted them. I mean, but it's also, that's an era where, radicals of various stripes were, the heart of the UAW. So that's, and Sinclair himself was, vaguely described as a socialist. He had socialist sensibilities, But I think that, since, the end of World War II, with the exception of a few unions, that type of political education was eradicated during, the long decades of anti-communism. and the American labor movement. And then, you know, in the decades since that all sort of fell apart, is that, you know, labor education or labor history as it is taught, where it is taught, is pretty weak tea. And so I think that, I would love it if more people, you know, read The Package King, and they should feel free to be very critical of it if they believe it's wrong as a whole or in parts, or what the legacy of these things mean. But, you know, trying to get books reviewed. I mean, you know, Haymarket is not an academic publisher. I'm not an academic writer. You know, so, you know, the best review of my book was done by Danny Ketch, who was a former UPS worker and a comrade of mine in the Independent in New York. And he wrote this really wonderful review, but, you know, it's been, you know, to get them reviewed even by the left-wing press is very difficult. And sometimes I'm mystified by why, you know. Part of it also has to do with, I think, you know, how people, you know, teachers and nurses are clearly at the forefront of the struggles around workplace safety in the pandemic. And that's fantastic. And those histories need to be written. And while, you know, logistics workers got a little bit of glamorous media coverage in the early days of the pandemic, it's noticeable that that's kind of receded very recently. So I think that, you know, we need to kind of, you know, figure out how, you know, more books, you know, whether it's mine or other people who write about these, you know, which are now recognized as essential workers, can get the reviews and the attention and the distribution that they need. But unfortunately, I wouldn't look to the top leaderships of the unions to do any of that, who tend to be fairly guarded, conservative people who are as afraid of criticism as they are of their rank and file workers voting them out if they have the right to vote again. So history is not a dead issue anywhere.
No,
and battles
absolutely
over,
not.
and battles over history are really, you know, battles over the present.
We're seeing them right now with the whole, you know, 1619 versus the Trump's new 1776
Right.
commission. Yeah, we're
Right.
definitely seeing debate
Right.
over how history is shared, and that's kind of
Right.
the thing that stands out to me about a rank and file history is, you know, it challenges, you know, those predominantly ethnocentric company management based narratives. I mean, I you know.
Well, I also think it has to, you know, I also think it's, you know, it reveals something of, you know, how people view themselves in the making of history, because, you know, again, one of the negative impacts of something like The Irishman, which, you know, which may be great cinema. I thought it was too long myself,
Same.
and having a bunch of guys in their 70s and nearly 80 playing men who were a third or half their age. I mean, it was a little odd. You know, you can let some younger actors in, guys, but people tend to view history as being done by powerful people, mostly men. And so the idea that they are actually people who can make their own history, rank and file workers, is still something very distant from people. I think that that's something that needs to be overcome. I mean, I think that, you know, one of the benefits, obviously, of the explosion of social history in the 1960s, much of that was, you know, under the impact of people like, you know, E.P. Thompson and many British Marxists, and how that was taken up by a whole generation of American historians has been, by and large, positive. You know, I don't want to add too many qualifiers to that. I think sometimes it led to these kind of micro histories and sometimes kind of hazy cultural histories that I'm not really quite sure, you know, and a kind of over specialization of small stuff. So the big picture kind of gets lost. But by and large, the idea of looking at history from the bottom up,
Right.
you know, was a beneficial thing. But that's something that, you know, didn't make its way into, you know, the vast majority of how, you know, people or, you know, working class Americans view history. And, you know, most Americans still unfortunately learn history from Hollywood or from television. And while there may be the occasional good television history series or the occasional good movie, You know, I mean, films like Glory are fantastic films, or Make One, you know. John Sayles is not exactly a Hollywood guy either who made Make One, right? But some of these, you know, I'm sure I'm leaving something out and somebody will get mad about this, but, you know, but I'm sure I am. But, it's not that people view themselves as these things. So when you say a rank and file history, you know, what I'm trying to say to people is that in this massive corporation, that's now become this global behemoth that began as a bicycle messenger service, is to understand that its wealth and prosperity comes from the hard work of tens of millions of people, probably at this point, who worked for UPS in its various incantations over the years, that much of the stuff that was done to challenge the kind of corrupt mafia business unionism and to make the Teamsters at least a more democratic union than it was, came from radicals and rank and file workers. And that, you know, the UPS strike of 1997 would not have succeeded without rank and file workers holding the line across the country. And that, you know, over the last few years, we've seen rank and file workers at UPS once again beginning to vote down rotten deals, or to vote them down and to have them imposed by the Hoffa leadership. And so with an election coming up next year in the Teamsters, hopefully some of these rank and file issues will come to the forefront and make a difference about, you know, not only who's elected, but about the general direction of the union. And when I say it about UPS, I also mean that about Amazon workers. I mean that about FedEx workers and all the other workers who are, you know, that we've learned from the teacher strikes in particular, that you can take control of the union as moribund. You can dramatically change its political direction, and you can fight and you can win. And we need more of that back in the bigger industrial unions today.
So my last, I have one more question. Well, it's two.
Sure.
I'm going to fit them together.
Okay.
It's about logistics.
Sure.
So what I found like really, really fascinating in your book was the conversation about the, you know, the growth of, not just the growth of the logistics industry, but UPS's shift to focusing on logistics. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that evolution, but then taking it into a current context, as you essentially just did, and thinking about Amazon and FedEx, the pandemic, essential workers. You know, you talk about how if, you know, logistics workers organized into one union, how this would be transformative for the working class.
Well, I just think that when you use the term logistics, you know, it's an old military term, right? And it's become more used in the corporate civilian world, and now that's how it's understood. And what makes it different from the way that production and distribution were organized, say, 50 or 60 years ago, is that almost every major corporation, whether it's retail or transport or manufacturing, is a logistics corporation now. And what that means is that instead of being involved in, say, seasonal production and distribution, right, is that corporations are now involved in the management of whole supply chains, from where goods are sold or delivered to, right back to where they are manufactured. And so what that has meant is that while production still dominates distribution in this country or worldwide, it does mean that the big, what we would call retail giants, their emergence and prominence is an example of what we mean by managing whole supply chains. So Walmart is a logistics company. Amazon's a logistics company. UPS is a logistics company. And of course, what makes, say, Amazon different from UPS is that UPS delivers other people's goods. You know, Amazon delivers their goods. And so this may tell us something, or we'll see how this evolving battle over where UPS is still by far, I think, the package king. But over the next few years, you'll see where a Walmart, which announced that it was creating its own version of Prime, where Amazon announced that it was going to build 1,000 warehouses in local neighborhoods as opposed to just in, regional or citywide hubs, right? To facilitate its overnight delivery of goods. Whether a UPS will continue to be dominant just by by being a delivery company, right? We'll see what this battle, and that goes for FedEx too, how they change their premier services or their core operations to deal with this new intense period of, I would say, competition both on a national and a global level. And what I think this means for, broadly speaking, for the workers in all these industries is that, whether they may all wear very different looking uniforms, but all of them essentially do the same thing, right? And so the question will be, how can we bring all these rank and file workers together? And there was some attempt at doing days of action around this back in the springtime and during the early pandemic. But I think we can probably say for sure that that's not going to come out of the leadership of the unions. It's going to have to come out of the actual rank and file workers themselves. And if history is an indicator from, the 30s through the 70s and 80s, is that socialists and other radicals are going to have to be playing a central role in that. And so, while that's not the most specific of conclusions, it's just the way that I kind of feel about, the general direction of things. And we're going to be entering in, or we're still in, as far as I can tell, phase one of the pandemic in the United States, is that who knows over the next year what this is actually going to, mean for the health and of not only millions of people in their various workplaces, but particularly for, workers in the big logistics companies that not only work in these massive hubs with hundreds, if not thousands of employees, and the potential for being centers of super spread of the pandemic is great, but also delivery workers who have contact with, dozens to hundreds of people a day, are live issues, and what both rank and file workers and their unions or not are prepared to do about them. And again, we know from the teachers and the nurses that there are job actions, or the threat of job actions has had a beneficial effect. And you can't help but think that that's going to be on the agenda at all the big logistics giants, including UPS, over the next year.
But it's
I would
interesting.
be surprised if it isn't. I mean, that's, in my opinion.
Happened already is kind of, and I think one thing that you just mentioned that resonated with me was kind of the role in the, the politicization of these workers. But then I think about, left politics and how, in terms of organized left politics, there's really only the DSA. And
there's that, but I think that the other thing about this, I would say, Alan, is that one cannot discount at all, the impact of a lot of very backward ideas on American workers. One of the things I tried to point out about the, in some of my articles about the 2016 Teamster election is that it isn't surprising, on one hand, that, Hoffa suffered these catastrophic losses throughout the Midwest and the upper Midwest, and they broadly corresponded where Trump also won, okay? Which first means that the political establishment is not what people are into, whether it's the Teamsters or the Democrats or the Republicans, right? So they both went for outsiders. But it also goes to show you that, there's some pretty backward ideas that exist among the Teamsters rank and file, despite the fact also that 2/3 of the Teamster membership is Black and Latino. So I think that one of the things that, I've tried to highlight in some of my writings is that, the potential for the Teamsters both being a vehicle to fight racism and better working conditions also has to confront the racism within the rank and file of the union. And I can tell you from, people I talk to across the country is that, Trump has support among UPS workers and Teamsters. He did in 2016, and I'm not surprised now. And, for 20 years, the Teamsters, which particularly in the trucking industries relies heavily on international trade, and this is kind of the bizarre aspects of some of the Teamster stuff, has also spent 20 years attacking China as a source of problems. But, you know, UPS, Amazon and FedEx are owned by Americans. The conditions in the logistics industry were sponsored by UPS. So, China is a distraction, but the kind of xenophobia that you found historically in the UAW and the steelworkers exists well within the Teamsters. And I think that, those are the things that any new rank and file movement has to confront. Even during the GM strike last year, there was a couple of very interesting articles that said, GM is on strike and Trump has plenty of supporters here. So, workers can strike and also have reactionary ideas. And I think for, trying to change all those things, is something that requires a kind of radical politics, the kind of weak-kneed liberalism or the anemic Democratic Party politics are irrelevant to dealing with those issues. They really are.
Oh, but how does the left challenge that, especially when, the predominant narrative demonizes anything that is essentially left of center right?
Well, I think that that's true, but it's also true that socialism has gone through something of a rebirth in this country. That I think the thing that we're at a kind of very both opportune and dangerous political moment, because we've just gone through a national uprising, which, tens of millions of people went out and marched against particularly police racism following George Floyd's murder. I'm sure plenty of those people work at UPS or FedEx or, Amazon. And those issues, impact the question of racism inside of America's workplaces and inside the big logistics giants. And at the same time, Bernie Sanders' campaign in some ways showed that socialism is popular in a very broad sense, even though Bernie's socialism was essentially New Deal liberalism. But it legitimized socialist politics for a lot of people. So, the question is how do you make that relevant into the workplaces of the United States? And that's something that really requires a lot of discussion and experimentation. It's just not something you can say one thing about or just draw one conclusion from. But I think, organized socialist politics is we have a different situation right now than we've had for a very long time. So that makes it optimistic to me about the potential for that. But at the same time, I have great concerns about, people can be, one of the things we learned about from the history of the far right is that they can be very clever at, pointing out the inadequacies of capitalism and then turning that into anti-Semitism or other forms of bigotry. And that can resonate among workers. And in a country like the United States, which has that peculiar history of, first being a settler colony and long history of the slave trade and racism, but likes to portray itself in this kind of nostalgic, sometimes, maudlin way of being a nation of immigrants, is a country where anti-immigrant sentiment is also quite disturbingly widespread. And again, resonates inside, the working class far too much, particularly when people compete to prove that they're real Americans as opposed to, others. And so I think these are live issues, and particularly in the big logistics giants, which tend to draw in, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers over the course of a year. I mean, Amazon and both UPS, I'm sure FedEx too, are going to, put on their, every year announce they'll be hiring another 100,000 workers for the Christmas rush, usually known as peak season at UPS. And when you bring in, tens, 20, hundreds of thousands of people, you're bringing in people who have a wide variety of both life experiences, ideas, and political experiences, that can, sometimes bring people together and sometimes push people apart. And I just think you have to acknowledge those things in order to deal with them.
Yeah,
Pretending that they don't exist, and or thinking that just economic issues will bring people together, that is, I think history shows that that's a dangerous game to play.
yeah, one of my like just recent housemates was a driver for UPS.
Mhm.
He was hospitalized during the pandemic for shortness of breath, was
Right,
tested for coronavirus, and sent home. Interestingly enough, he's also a Trump supporter
right,
who had no interest in filling out the census,
right,
no interest in any sort of
right.
organizing or anything like that. He was very, very much still just a company man, I guess. And
Mhm.
that kind of blew my mind, where I was just like, you're working this job and you got hospitalized for shortness of breath, not tested, and
Mhm.
you come out and you're not critical in any way, shape, or form.
Well, they're critical of other things that just don't seem to be related at all to what's really going on with them. And so I just think that it's very important, to sort of recognize that all that's out there, but also then to treat people as individuals. I mean, there's too much of a tendency to sort of treat people who we, have as just simply being mouthpieces for, Fox News. And while that may be a big influence on them, if you treat people like that, they're just going to stop listening to you, because people have also, sometimes odd life experiences or real life experiences that lend them to believe in this sort of stuff. I mean, look at, patriotism and chauvinism is not just embraced by people of the Goonie right, it's also embraced by plenty of people who see themselves as liberal and progressive and open-minded, right through plenty of people on the left who consider themselves, you gotta love America if you're really gonna change it. And it's like, well, I don't know if that's a pretty dangerous game to play too, because
For sure.
others have a bigger claim on being America. Socialists don't, and I think what America does to its own people and what it does to the rest of the world is something we should be very clear that we're not for.
Yeah, I'm always mindful.
Yeah.
My advisor in history always tells me, just to be mindful that the rest of the world exists.
Well, look at I remember soon after Trump was elected, there was I only because I found it particularly strange that it stayed with me is that there was this Australian doctor who had a piece in the New York Times opinion page online. So one, I don't know how Australian doctors get into the New York Times opinion page. Most of us can't, but anyway. And I mean, I just thought it was funny. I mean, you gotta have to have a friend, right? That's how that works, right? But her piece was what was it? I was born in the American century. I'm not ready to say goodbye. Well, my only response to that was, well, that just depends on what end of the cruise missile you're on, right?
Right.
So, I think that, for a generation of people, and of course, this is part of the people at Bernie that occupy, and then Bernie gave some shape and content to, is that they've grown up in a world of not just student debt, but, low-paying jobs, now a pandemic, and the legacy of the Iraq War, and living in the world's biggest kind of stumbling empire where so much money is spent on defense. These things are not removed from working class people's lives. And I think that, or from debates in the workplaces, and so when you talk about building a political alternative in the workplace, it's not just talking about the immediate issues of wages and working conditions. That's certainly important. I mean, I when I was a workplace activist, that's what I did. But, I also knew and experienced and did talk about, the war in Iraq, what it meant, what its consequences were, because, if you can't tie what's going on in the world to what's going on in your workplace, and tie in what's going on in your workplace to what's going on in the world, then we don't raise the level of class consciousness, which I think is a prerequisite for not only rebuilding a labor movement, but raising the political level of the most radical political workers. And because the logistics giants like UPS and Amazon, FedEx, and the post office, and whoever comes next, because there will be someone else. History always tells us that. Is that these are the major companies in which not only millions of workers will work at, but in many ways, the future of the industrial labor movement will rise and fall on.
I think that is a perfect place to leave it. And I've already taken up an hour and a half of your time.
That's all right, man.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll leave it there. Joe, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk with me.
Sure.
This has been a great conversation. I almost wish it could continue. But yeah,
Next time.
yeah, definitely.